very good to see all of you here. When I was talking to these guys earlier about them filming me, they said rather plaintively, after they established my name, do you have a job title? Which I don't. Do you have an institutional affiliation? Which I don't. I am just me. And that's a sort of strange thing to be, really, because I have one of these careers where I did pursue both institutional affiliation and a job title. And by the end of it, I was on the 18th floor of Canary Wharf, and I had a title a bit like Assistant Deputy Executive Editor of The Independent. And you will know, if you've ever had a title like that, that meant that I was in charge of new chairs. That was my key power, that if someone wanted a new chair, they came to see me. And the longer my title got, the more boring my job got. And actually, the less power I had to change anything, and the less opportunity I had to do anything interesting. So 14 years ago, I just started working for myself, and I just decided I wouldn't have a title, I wouldn't have an affiliation. All I would do is do things that were interesting for me and other people, that I would stop doing things if I stopped learning, because I've found in jobs that I constantly stopped learning after about 2 years. And I would seek to make new relationships, because I think it's very difficult to learn and do new things unless you make new relationships. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And actually, I'm not capable of any original thinking whatsoever. All that I'm capable of is moving between different situations and carrying messages from one to the other. And my experience largely of most innovation and most innovators is that they are inveterate borrowers, mixers, combiners, minglers, blenders. They very rarely sit with their head in their hands on their own trying to dream up a brand new idea. They're mainly trying to combine things in practice to find out if they work, and they're kind of constantly kind of improvising and fiddling and trying to find designs that create new blends. And what I want to talk about today is some work that I did over the course of last year with the sponsorship of Cisco, the computer company, who were just kind of big enough and had enough money to allow a small chunk to go to me, to go and ask a kind of stupid question in a way. And that is, where would you go in order to see the future of education? The vantage point that you take will determine virtually everything that you see. And most of, well, often, if not all of the problems, then a lot of the problems with innovation, particularly in any public setting, is that we don't think about the vantage point we're adopting. We assume that the vantage point we happen to be seeing things from is the right vantage point because we're a vice-chancellor or a director of children's services or what have you. And actually engineering a different vantage point proves very, very difficult. One of the things that constantly strikes me when I'm talking to civil servants is, and people in positions of power of any kind really, is their complete inability to imagine the lives of the people their policies affect, because there's no systematic way of getting to those people and connecting with those lives. So the vantage point you take determines much of what you see. So where might you go and see the future of education? Well, we have, by and large, I think, had two answers to that, neither of them adequate. The first, by and large, in secondary education is you go to Finland, or maybe South Korea, but it's a long way away. So you go to Finland. Finland is, you know, the outstanding success story of the last 30 years in education. It's simply stunning what they do. There's a 2% dropout rate. There's a 0.5% repeat rate. Extremely high standards in basics. And yet Finnish children start school later than most children, and they spend less time at school than most children. Finland doesn't spend more per capita on education than other OECD countries, and yet it gets outstanding results. The trouble with going to Finland is that it's so good. And how on earth would you replicate the success of Finland in a more culturally diverse, bigger society? Finland's, you know, roughly speaking, 5 to 7 million people, culturally extremely homogeneous. Another place that we go is, of course, we go to technology, and that might give you, and does indeed give you, very powerful insights into what education might become. But I chose another starting point, and the starting point I chose was places like this, which you can't really see very well, I suspect. But this is Monkey Hill. This is one of hundreds of favelas in Rio de Janeiro. And there are places like this all over the developing world. And I'm just going to read a little section from the report that I wrote about this work. I've got a few copies here if anyone wants one at the end. And this is the reason I decided to take myself off last year and go and visit places like this. Urbanization, perhaps the chief demographic force of the 20th century, will be even more powerful in the 21st. In 1950, there were 86 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. By 2015, there'll be 550 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. The world's urban population will grow by the equivalent of 6 new megacities of 12 million people a year, more than 70 million. Cities in the developing world will grow fastest. Over the last decade, 1990 to 2000, the urban population of the developing world rose by 500 million people to almost 2 billion. The combined urban population of China, India and Brazil, the population that lives in cities in those places, is greater than the total population of Europe and the United States combined. China has 97 city regions with 1 million plus inhabitants. India has 40. The United States has 39. China added more urban dwellers in the 1980s than all of Europe in the 19th century. 30 years ago, 9 out of 10 people in China lived in the countryside. By 2020, almost 2/3 of China's population will be urban. 1950, the developing world accounted 40% of the urban population. By 2030, it will be 80%. So the biggest shift of population, of need, of challenge will be in the developing world. It will be found in cities. And a huge share of that population will end up in places like this. Informal settlements, slums, favelas, on the edge of richer areas, living cheek by jowl. You can, all throughout Rio, you can find places like this which are serving labour to places nearby which are extraordinarily rich. And although these places differ all over the world, and a place like this is very different from a place like Kibera in Nairobi or the slums in Delhi or Mumbai, they have different histories, different ways of organising themselves, different legal status even. One of the key characteristics is that traditional institutions and public services don't reach them. They're either not interested in them, or if they are interested in them, they're incapable of operating in them. So you very rarely find hospitals, schools, welfare programs, the police, any form of state provision or interference operating in the heart of these places. Yet these are the places where we'll find the fastest growing, youngest populations in the world over the next century. These are the places where our biggest challenge of disease, crime, poverty, and climate change in many ways will have to be solved. These are the places where you should go if you want to test really hard innovation. So these are, again, you can't really see this guy. This is a test case. One of the things that we very rarely do in public policy is test our thinking against people. We tend to deal in kind of structures and policies and programs and so on and so forth, the kind of meta view. This is a guy called Wanderson, and I met him in Monkey Hill. Monkey Hill is run by a drugs gang that Wanderson isn't part of. He was part of another drugs gang called the Three Amigos. At the age of 14, Wanderson dropped out of school and joined the drugs trade full time. He did that because that's the way you get money, guns, girls, motorcycles, gold, so on and so forth. At the age of 16, he was running the drugs trade in 10 favelas. He was employing about 160 people, and he was turning over $100,000 a week. So this is kind of the thing that you need with someone like Wanderson, How would you design education to pull someone away from that? Where that is what is creating opportunity, power, influence in his community. Well, the interesting thing about him is that at the age of 18, he was lucky enough to be arrested and lucky enough to be sent to a youth detention centre where there was a computer suite installed by a remarkable organisation called CDI. CDI, created by a remarkable social entrepreneur called Rodrigo Baggio, who in 1994 had taken some computers into the heart of a favela in Rio and just set up a learning centre with the intention of finding out if you gave people computers and some basic programs, what could they learn? And you link the learning to the conditions in their community. Wanderson got turned on by the computers. His first thought was, can I steal one and sell it? Then he became hooked by it and eventually left prison, went back to school and is now a CDI organiser. These girls, Maureen and Isha, live in Kibera, which is a vast slum along this railway line that goes out of Nairobi. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people live in this slum. This is a different kind of place because all these mud huts behind you are actually owned and people pay rent to live in them. If you come to Nairobi, it's this kind of place that you hope to live in. Because actually this isn't a bad slum. This is walking distance to the city centre. A really bad slum is Dandora, which is probably 30 minutes outside where you have to get a matutu to get into town and you're really, really isolated. But they're not completely isolated. They have just completed their Kenyan Certificate of Secondary Education, modelled on the British Certificate of Secondary Education. Kenyan education is more British than Britain. I mean, you'll find all over the developing world, particularly in Kenya and India, schools that look like something out of the 1950s in the UK. But the opportunity to go on to college for them is now beyond their means. It would be too expensive, far too expensive for them. So they're part of a self-help girls network, which is about trying to support one another to carry on learning and to save money, become financially capable, and basically also to resist men. Because the biggest issue in places like this is HIV. You can go to schools all over Kenya, places like this, where 50% of the children will have one parent and the other 50% will have no parent. And so places like this are just being ravaged by AIDS. So the biggest issue in their lives is, and if you wanted to design education around it, is don't become HIV positive. That's what education should achieve. The interesting thing about these places, which I'll come back to, which is true now of the developing world in general, is that the one infrastructure that crosses the rich and the poor almost equally is the mobile phone. The one thing that you will find, along with religion, actually, the other thing is religion, you'll find in these places, as much as you'll find outside, is the mobile phone. And so were you to design from scratch public services to reach into these places, you would organise it all, it seems to me, initially around access to mobiles. And then I went to India. This is Pune, which is the fastest growing city in Asia, 5,000 construction sites, absolutely unchanged by the global crash. And in Delhi, I met these girls who again had just finished their secondary education. The remarkable thing, these girls live in a place called the Madangir Resettlement Colony on the edge of Delhi. They've never been into the centre of Delhi. I mean, it's 20 minutes away. They've never seen the gate of India. They have no idea what the rest of Delhi looks like. They think that a big trip is to walk 4 kilometres to the nearest market. The remarkable thing about these girls is that they're not married. Because 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, they would already have been married. The idea that they would have carried on their education, completely unthought of. Why have they carried on learning? Well, it's not because they go to great schools. It's because a revolutionary entrepreneur called Saugata Mitra, about a decade ago, brought some computers encased in yellow steel and put them at the entrance to their slum. And each night after school, they would go down as a group and start playing on these computers. There was no fantastic software. It's all incredibly basic, kind of game-based software, learning through games. You can learn about the human body, you can learn about history, about science, about mathematics, all through these games. Thousands upon thousands of fingers have kind of fingered these mouses and keyboards and all the rest of it. They're still there. They look like kind of heavy-duty ATMs with computers inside. And their story is these computers allowed us to carry on learning. Why? Because it was fun, because it was engaging, because it was about us, none of which is true of school. So what I did was I went round these places and with a researcher gathered the stories of about 100 socially entrepreneurial organizations working in places like this. El Sistema in Venezuela, Barefoot College in rural India, the Afghan Institute for Learning, one of the most remarkable, which maintained girls' education in Afghanistan under the rule of the Taliban with an underground series of schools. Really asking the question, well, if you were to try and design, not from our world, what schools should be like, and then import them into this world, the world of Madangir or Kibera, but look at how social entrepreneurs are trying to devise solutions and then scale up the principles of that, what would that look like? Look at innovation designed for extreme environments. And what I found was, firstly that education, everywhere you go, is a kind of global religion. People believe in it. It's got a kind of redemptive power. I sat with a woman on the edge of Kibera running that girls' education project and said, what are the parents like of the people who come to your project? And she said, they're a third Christian, a third Muslim, and a third believe in pagan African faiths. I said, is there any difference in their attitude towards education? And she said, none whatsoever. They all absolutely believe in education. It's like a kind of unifying global religion that education will provide redemption. And when you provide education plus technology, that creates a kind of sense of hope often in these places. So I sat with a guy in a favela just south of Rio. This is a place run by paramilitaries where you can't get access to any kind of service, really, without going through paramilitaries. I said, what gives you hope living in kind of such desperate circumstances with such constraints on what you can do and with such limits imposed by people like that? And he said, well, the thing that really gives us hope is education and technology, the ability to connect through technology to ideas, people, sources, networks which lie beyond our community. That's what gives us hope. And so that's why CDI is there. And CDI, interestingly, operates in all these favelas kind of in a way that the state can't, working through, alongside and around drug gangs and paramilitaries. So what I then thought was, well, were there lessons from all of this that we might bring back to our world? And why would they be relevant? And the reason they're relevant, it seems to me, is that in our world, of course, innovation in education systems is extremely hard because they're encased by regulation and dominated by incumbents and highly professionalized. And so the idea of radical new entry to shake up the education industry is very difficult to imagine. But the reason why it's worth it, it seems to me, is that some of our biggest problems actually resemble, in some regards, these sorts of places. If you go to Wythenshawe, or if you go to the most desperate parts of Thanet in Kent, or Darlington, you'll find devastated communities where the biggest issues are not really just about schools, they're about family aspirations, communities, culture, capabilities, outlook, so on and so forth. In other words, the ingrained educational failure in those communities is probably the biggest single cause of underlying educational underperformance and economic underperformance, in my view. And our consistent failure to find ways to get into those communities, to really re-energize them and to build their own capabilities is one of the longest term problems. And so it might be that if you take some of the lessons developed in the slums of Latin America and India, they might have more relevance to parts of our devastated inner city landscape than we might imagine. They might have more relevance and more purchase even than learning from Finland or South Korea. And so I developed just this very simple way of thinking about innovation in public services and education in particular. And I'll just quickly run through it. I mean, this is very, very crude. Consultants love it. And all it says basically is there are two types of innovation. There's sustaining innovation, which sustains an existing business model or organization. There's disruptive innovation, which disrupts and changes that by doing it in an entirely new way. And there's formal innovation, in other words, innovation in formal settings, institutions and organizations that are already established. And there's informal settings, which in the case of schools and colleges is in families and communities, which are not structured by regulations or professionals or what have you. And if you divide the world up in that kind of way, just crudely, it gives you four basic kind of innovation strategies which governments and cities and educational institutions can pursue. And the first and the most obvious is this, which is sustaining innovation in formal settings, and that means getting better schools. And the kind of recipe for getting better schools and better education, if you look at Finland and South Korea and the best performing parts of Canada or Australia or indeed even England and Scotland even more so, is this really: you get good people into teaching. 10% of people who apply for teaching jobs, teacher training in Finland get accepted. They reject 90%. Teaching in Finland has an incredibly high status. It's not very highly paid, it's reasonably well paid, but it's just got a very high social status, and they have a very high cut-off. So they only accept 10%. They train them really well, they importantly manage them really well, and they give them really good conditions to work in. And when you get all of that getting together, you get good results. Now, the trouble with that strategy and applying that to the developing world is that there are lots of places you can't get just can't get teachers, full stop, let alone good teachers. Teachers who can speak English will often in India be recruited into international companies. They'll get much better pay in the private sector. And so if you look at formal education in a lot of these places, Brazil, just enormous quantities. I mean, probably half the Brazilian expenditure on education is spent on people repeating years. It's spent on not managing to do it right first time. India, on any one day, probably 25% of the Indian teaching workforce is not present at work. And only 50% of that workforce that's there is probably teaching, according to studies by Harvard and others where they've made a series of kind of surprise visits to school. So there's widespread acceptance in India that one of the biggest problems is the kind of rigidities of a highly unionized, incredibly rigid kind of teaching workforce. So to expect that we might meet the needs of these vastly exploding populations with better schools and teachers, that is going to take an enormously long time. And in the developed world, we know that, as I said, here at least, we've hit a kind of performance plateau, that doing more of what we've been doing won't get us to where we want to get to. And underlying that are these cultures of ingrained inequality, low aspiration and ambition, capability. And it's about families and communities and schools together. And more importantly, I suppose, there's a sort of danger underlying the whole debate about education. There's this danger that we might be hitting the target but completely missing the point. In other words, training people to do well in exams which bear no relation to the capabilities they'll need for the modern world. And so if you ask employers what people need, they are largely social skills to do with their ability to work together creatively and problem solve with other people. They're not to recount the 20 kings and queens in the Civil War, but that is what we spend an enormous amount of time doing in our history syllabus at GCSE. So for all of those reasons, this improve agenda, I think, just won't be enough. It won't get us to where we need to get to. So a next thing that people do is move from improve to reform or reinvent. And this is a move loved actually by professionals. And it has great merit as well. It's very exciting. And that is to say, create radically different kinds of school. And so all over the world now, you see governments attempting to open up education to new entrants, new ways of doing school. And you see things that are recognisably schools, but done very differently. So let me just give you a few examples. In the US charter schools, there's an amazing chain of schools called High Tech High, created by a guy called Larry Rosenstock, which starts from questions rather than a curriculum. It's highly interactive, very problem solving. Their whole educational philosophy is education is something you make and do, it's not something you receive. It's a kind of make activity. A similar set of principles underlie another chain of charter schools called the Big Picture schools, which are in the US and in Australia, which again emphasize creative problem solving as the core of their curriculum. You can go to Sweden, Kunskapsskolan schools in Sweden. Every child has a personalized timetable and curriculum, highly structured, very modular, huge amount invested in review and reflection, but it's stage not age. You learn by ability and style. All their school, they have 14 schools in Sweden, only 2 of them are in schools. Most of them are in buildings that weren't designed as schools. So the whole idea of the schools are kind of absolutely recognizable buildings. They've become even more cut off from society. Actually, Kunskapsskolan's going the other way, actually creating schools which are part of society. And you can find schools like this in extreme circumstances, like Jarragon, a community in northern Queensland, or Springdale School in India, or the Lumiere schools in Brazil. So I went to 2 Lumiere schools in Brazil, one high up in the mountains outside Sao Paulo, a rural community where a fair proportion of the kids don't have electricity at home. Many of their parents won't have completed secondary education. Quite a few will probably be illiterate. And I watched these kids use an interactive whiteboard connected to the net to read they read a newspaper every day at 12:30, and they had a discussion about Barack Obama's stimulus package. They were 8. So time and again what I found was that the combination of problem solving, collaboration, new technology, new roles for teachers was creating entirely new kinds of school that were much, much more engaging. And that learning in these settings was an activity you do with people, and you're engaged and you do it by yourself, but it's not something you do much where you're taking it just from people, or it's not done to you. It's much more a with activity. And you find, as I said, these much more personalised forms of approach. Generally schools that, even if they're big, feel small, teachers as coaches, pupils as more self-reflective protagonists, and a much more collaborative real-world approach to learning based around questions and problems rather than a curriculum. The trouble with that is that might get you new schools, but it rarely gets you new school districts. It doesn't get you new school systems. And the journey from improve to reform is incredibly difficult. The biggest obstacle are parents. Parents hate innovation in schooling. They are extremely conservative. The more engaged the parent is, the more conservative they're likely to be, by and large. The more sceptical they are about experiments being taken with their children. So Larry Rosenstock's story of trying to take those schools and change them and develop them is a big story of that. If you look at innovative schools in this country, the people who lead them and do this kind of thing are incredibly clever at managing expectations, at not letting standards slip whilst trying to do new things. It takes real skill. And often, interestingly, the innovators who can do this are what I call grey-haired revolutionaries. They are not young, they don't wear baseball caps. They tend actually to be quite old, been around the course a few times and know how to do it. But it's very tricky. And even if you get that, it may be that you get some of what you need. You might get Mossbourne in the middle of Hackney, an amazing school, Has it changed Hackney? No, it hasn't. It's provided a kind of oasis of kind of aspiration and capability in the middle of Hackney, but it hasn't changed life in Hackney. And changing life in Hackney is a really, really big job. So what then happens is that there's a third move that you can make, which is to say, okay, well, maybe then it's about innovation outside school, informal settings, but maybe to supplement school. We'll make the job of school easier if we innovate in family and community settings. And so we know from lots of academic work, James Heckman and others, that the social and emotional conditions of family life in the early years are a huge precondition for cognitive development and what people learn and their later performance at school. And so the whole growth of emotional resilience programs, parenting programs, family support programs, family nurse partnerships, so on and so forth, ways to get to families early so that you can change this becomes really critical. And as I said, then working with aspiration and ambition as the key drivers, not performance and delivery. So you see this in schools. You see, interestingly, the model of extended schools now, sort of stretching the boundaries of the schools, schools sort of drawing in community resources, providing resources for the community to do things, dispersing learning into the community. So there's a school in the northeast called Cramlington, where every Wednesday afternoon they do a kind of CPD session for all the teaching staff. And so they have activities led by community-based teachers who come in and run judo classes or drama classes or dance classes. But what would it be like if, why do teachers only live in schools? What would it be like if you had community-based teachers who could teach in all sorts of different settings in a community out there? And if you really wanted to reach people, particularly people who didn't want to come to school, what would it be like if you set up schools in shops, say abandoned shops, small studio schools, or even in houses on estates? So in other words, what would it be like if you worked on family, community and school at the same time and made that work much more effectively? And again, you see in the developing world huge innovations in this space which are very interesting. The most powerful is an amazing organisation in India called Pratham, which started in 1994 with a guy called Madhav Chavan. The interesting thing about Madhav, who's another amazing social entrepreneur, is that he was a trade union organiser. And he's brought to education the kind of ethic of trade union organisation, which is you mobilise people, you get them going, you give them very practical things to do. He views it through a sort of movement kind of lens rather than an institution lens. And Madhav has developed a way, out of his early innovation, to create preschool balwadis in people's homes, ultra low cost, with about 2 weeks training of a preschool leader who's probably a young girl who's finished secondary education, had a bit of training, enough to create a balwadi, paid a bit, can earn a bit from the balwadi. They now cater for 21 million children in India. It's the most significant educational social enterprise probably in the world. Started absolutely from scratch. They also run a program now to help children from more deprived backgrounds stay in school. So the biggest problem is you turn up to school, you've had no experience of school, your parents have never been to school. In the developing world, there's entire generations of first-time learners with families that have never done homework, never talked to a teacher, never done an exam. So you're sending these kids to schools which are extremely rigid. The dropout rate is very, very high. So Pratham is constantly trying to catch children and stay with them and get them back into school. Interesting thing about Madhav, who I met in Pune and talked to for about 4 hours, the conversation starting about 11:30 at night and ending about 3 o'clock. He set up Pratham and gained some momentum, and after a few years attracted some support from McKinsey, who came along. And they looked at what he was doing. They wanted to kind of provide some management consultant support to work out how to scale what he was doing. And they, after looking at his operation for a couple of weeks, they came back and said, well, we think you should turn this into something like McDonald's. You should create a template, That means wherever you go, you kind of roll it out in a kind of standardized format that will guarantee quality and so on and so forth. And Madhav turned to them and said, why don't we do it like a Chinese restaurant? Everywhere you go, there are Chinese restaurants, but there is no chain of Chinese restaurants. Chinese restaurants are recognizable. They provide often the same food. They have often the same music playing and the same decor, and they've got similar sorts of names, but they're all subtly different. And yet they're everywhere. So why couldn't you do it like the Chinese restaurant, i.e. same principles but different application, adapted to circumstance, highly modular? And that is the successful recipe of both Pratham, CDI, Hole in the Wall, and other schemes that I saw. It's the kind of Chinese restaurant model, not the McDonald's model. Because if you're going to connect with communities, you can't have rigid services. You have to respond to what communities can do and what they need. So it has to be adaptable. So the problem with this approach is, look, we might know that schools are dysfunctional, and we might know that you don't get the full solution, but at least we know where they are and what to invest in. Where do you invest in a community, and how can you measure the impact? If you're measuring ephemeral things like well-being, social capital, capability, things like that, what kind of people do you employ? Because teachers don't work in those kinds of settings. Actually, you need social workers don't really work. So you need kind of peer support or semi-qualified people. That is very alarming for a lot of people. So there are a lot of issues and challenges with that kind of approach. And then finally, down here, you find disruptive innovation in informal settings. That is entirely new ways of thinking about how you get learning to people. And when I looked at these most radical innovators, CDI, which now runs courses out of community centres with peer-to-peer learning, donated computers, 90,000 people a year across 9 Latin American countries. The Barefoot College, now in 20 locations across India, Hole in the Wall, 500,000 children across India using computers to learn largely on their own through self-organised learning, so on and so forth. If you look at those models, what do you find? Well, what you find is that they are pull systems, not push systems. Education in our world is for much of the time, it feels like a push system, particularly in secondary and around secondary. It's something that you're kind of pushed into, stuff is pushed at you, you are kind of compelled to do it, it's got a kind of structure which often you don't understand from within. In these settings where you're dealing with people who've got so many other things going on in their lives, whether it's the drugs trade or looking after siblings or working in the family business, to make education vital, you have to pull them. You have to attract them. And so that means that motivation becomes absolutely central to learning. It's not an add-on, it's the key thing. So what you find is that these schemes work on both extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. The extrinsic motivation is usually that they deliver a solution to something for you, whether it's earning a living or staying healthy or building a house or getting clean water. It's stuff that pays off. In other words, there's a kind of immediacy for it. So one of the problems with our education systems is that the payoffs are very long term. You have to wait for quite a long time before the payoff to your education comes through. That doesn't make sense in these places. You have to deliver it much more immediately. That means it has to be problem-oriented, problem-solving kind of education. And so you find quite a lot of these schemes have economic models for education which just are inconceivable here. So there's some great schools in Paraguay created by a social entrepreneur called Martin Burt, called farm schools, where literally the kids grow the food to sell the food to employ the teachers. The kids employ the teachers. The school is an economic organisation. It grows food to earn the income to employ the teachers. There are other models like with microcredit models where microcredit pays for the education. So there's something which is about the kind of economics of education which is very, very powerful about it. But the other thing that they do very powerfully is that they make education intrinsically interesting. So time and again what I found was people creating education programs that went through other things: football, photography, dance, circus, and music, classically music. The most impressive, El Sistema in Venezuela, hundreds of child orchestras. What El Sistema has done is use music to make education entertaining, interesting, compelling, disciplined, collaborative. And so you find this learning through. This is a music program. It's not a school. It's an orchestra. It's not a school. There aren't teachers. There are people who lead the orchestra. But you learn through being part of an orchestra. So this whole message of learning through, rather than education being head-on, it comes through something else. You'll find that they use a whole variety of places for learning, often not schools, houses, open spaces, school platforms, community centres. They're incredibly adaptive about where learning takes place. They're not confined to school. And you'll find them using a whole variety of technologies. Very little internet, because very few of them got it. Lots of mobile phones. And then all sorts of technologies that we wouldn't even think of. El Sistema in Venezuela uses the violin as a technology for learning. There are an enormous number of schemes in Africa which use footballs as technologies for learning. So the idea that technology for learning has to be a sort of complicated or high-tech thing is completely wrong. It could be very, very basic. And as I said, learning is a kind of productive activity in these settings. It's a kind of making and doing thing. So this is the way that we think about education and innovation and reform. We start with improvement, and then because improvement doesn't do enough, we move to reinvention, a bit of reinvention, maybe a bit of supplementation, joining things together, and eventually, if we've got the energy, the time, and the money, which we rarely have, we might get to a bit of transformational innovation. I think that the challenge is whether you can start more from here, from the disruptive end, or from all those segments on the outside, and attack it from that angle rather than just relying on the improvement approach. And so in our systems, actually, it looks like this, it seems to me, that we put all our emphasis on improve. We leave a little over, often for disruptive but marginal groups. So you'll find the most innovative approaches often in pupil referral units or special needs units or not school or so on and so forth, but outside the mainstream. And so one of the questions would be, should it look like that, or should it look like that, or could you combine all these together in some new and different way? But it does seem to me that coming back from the developing world, we simply won't meet the huge aspirations that in part we have generated in these places for education unless we sanction, fund, support completely different ways of thinking how learning is possible to create low-cost learning at high quality in a very distributed framework, rather than relying on essentially a social innovation invented in Prussia and adapted in England and the US in the 19th century to deliver solutions of a kind that are probably not relevant to many of the needs of these communities. So what's the relevance of all this coming back to us and our problems? Well, a couple of weeks ago, I spent a fantastic afternoon with something called the West Everton Children's Orchestra. It's a school in Everton, the Faith Primary School, which is an orchestra. If you go to that school, you have to join the orchestra. So the orchestra is tea ladies, teachers, support workers, and children. They're all in the orchestra. 2 mornings a week, the entire school stops and does instrumental lessons together. They have lunchtime clubs, after-school clubs, ensemble groups. Everyone is in the orchestra. What the orchestra has done, it's only 9 months old, deliberately modelled on El Sistema, is provide in that place several things. Ritual, coming together, making things together, collaboration, discipline, and the violins that these kids have got are amongst the most precious things that these kids will have ever seen in their lives. And so when they introduced the orchestra, in conjunction with the Liverpool Phil, to this school, the teachers initially said, yeah, we can do it, but we're not going to do it with year 6 because we've got SATs. After a week, they said, you know what, whatever SATs they're going to take is not going to change their lives. This could change their lives. And so all of the school is now involved in an orchestra that is a school that is an orchestra. I'm working with CDI, the organisation that helped Wonderthon, and we're developing a programme in the UK focused around smartphones. How could you get into inner city communities and get kids developing apps for smartphones which have social purpose? Hole in the Wall, Sugata Mitra is working between Newcastle and India, is having many of the same scepticism in Newcastle about whether children can learn through computers, and is getting many of the same results. The most amazing finding, the most amazing story of his sort of escapade to show that children can lead learning themselves with computers, with the right kind of mediation, often not by a teacher but by a kind of peer or someone slightly older, is a story he tells about going to a fishing village in Kerala and dropping off these computers loaded with software in English to teach biotechnology. So this is all about DNA, recombination, so on and so forth. And he does the same sort of computer, same software with a private school in Delhi. And the experiment is to see whether the kids in Delhi will learn quicker and better than the kids in Kerala. The kids in Kerala don't speak English as a first language, so it's a bit of a disadvantage. Goes back after 3 months, nothing is happening. Goes back after 6 months, sits the kids down, they're very, very quiet. And he says, so what's going on? And then after a while, a girl at the back pipes up and in English says, the problem is the explanation of recombinant DNA isn't clear enough. And they get 65% in their GCSE biotechnology exam. So in extreme conditions, when you put computers and technology in the right environment, you can produce really remarkable results. We're nowhere near exploiting that. Because basically, we put technology into education institutions and it gets colonized by teachers, basically. The history of innovation in education is that it works when it supports teachers. So there's a whole series of lessons, I think, that we can draw which could apply and adapt some of this transformational innovation from these settings into our settings. But there's finally, I think, just one thing that I want to mention, which I think is about the future of public services, really, in general, which applies, I think, to virtually any public service now. And that is the relationship between this kind of improve agenda and these other agendas, which particularly on the right-hand side deal with community. Because I think one of the things that we've learned, just as the money has run out, is that what we've learned is that public service improvement in and of itself does not make for better lives and better communities. It might deliver certain services which might solve particular needs, but it doesn't change lives and communities often in a sustainable way. In other words, wherever you look, whether it's in the relationship between hospitals and health, or schools and learning, or indeed cultural institutions and the culture of cities, there's often a huge disconnect between public services and how life is led. And so, the whole drift of public services over the last 10, 15, even 20 years has been that the key features of public services should be that they comply, they are compliant with law, regulation, risk management, so on and so forth, and that they perform, they improve performance. And so it's a sort of perform and comply agenda. But actually, that doesn't get you what you need as a successful society, which is resilient, adaptive, capable communities and citizens. So if your agenda is resilience and capability in communities and citizens, performing and complying public services doesn't get you there. You need there the influence of social networks, of self-motivation, of mutual organisation, of other kinds of things. So if you were, for instance, to look at, you mentioned Salford Quays, if you were to change the focus slightly and look at Liverpool, Liverpool's capital of culture, The story of Liverpool's capital of culture, it seems to me, is that there is a huge story about Liverpool and culture, which is embedded in formal institutions of culture. And then there is another story, which is about how Liverpudlians make culture in their everyday lives, which might have some connection with these things. Now, these things over here are absolutely essential, because without them, the city may well have just imploded. But it doesn't mean that life lived over here has really changed. And to get into life lived over here, you would need to operate culture more as a sort of guerrilla force than as an institutional force. And that is the challenge now, I think, facing virtually every public service, is what's the relationship between these big things that we have and the lives that we would like to think that people want to lead, the communities that they live in, and how do you change those, and how do you connect them up, and how does one lead to the other? So final way of thinking about it is that the significance of this stuff in this transform box is where and how you look for solutions to social problems, and who might have the solutions and how they might be organised. So if you take one of the kind of clearest achievements of public policy, a public good, created over the last 10, 15 years, one of the completely unambiguous ones is that fewer people die through domestic fires. The number of people who die through domestic fires, through smoke inhalation particularly, has just gone down dramatically. In Lewisham, it's gone down by 80% in 10 years. So that, I think, is a kind of unalloyed good public outcome. How has this come about? Has it come about through better fire engines and bigger fire engines and better fire stations and so on and so forth? Well, a bit of it has, but mainly it's come about through smoke alarms. You get more smoke alarms into the right kind of houses, multi-occupancy houses, where there tends to be a lot of cooking with fat, and then you get fewer fires and fewer deaths. If you combine that with better building regulations, better furniture regulations, less smoking, you get more people living longer, fewer dying through fires. So the answer is not the fire engine, it's the smoke alarm. And this is the problem with the public sector as we've got it, is that you come along to virtually any problem and, kind of, we've got this problem, social care, ageing, families, reoffending, youth offending, you name it. So what tools have we got available to solve these problems? And the civil servants will basically say, well, we've got fire engines, because that's what we've invested in all these years. We've got fire engines and fire stations. And you could join them up, or you could reorganize them slightly, or you could paint them a different color, or you could put a web interface on the front of them, but basically they're fire engines. And they are secondary schools, big prisons, big acute hospitals, daycare centres for old people. They are discrete institutions which deliver service. So what if the solution is a smoke alarm? What's the smoke alarm solution to learning, families, ageing? What's a solution that works out there with people, a technology that's distributed but creates a huge public good, but is impossible in many ways to measure and control? That, it seems to me, is the big agenda for public services. It's the smoke alarm agenda. Making that work, I think, is going to be the big task of the next 10 years. Making sure that politicians don't use it simply as an excuse to offload risk onto the rest of society and get people to do it themselves because the state won't do it is another big challenge. But that, it seems to me, is the agenda for the future of virtually any public service, is think smoke alarm. I'll leave it there.